Welcome to Sleepy Tales. My name is Mateus, and before we begin today's story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below saying, "I'll sleep well tonight." Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into tonight's tale. As soon as the young psychologist, Dr. Jacob Andrews, stepped into the abandoned asylum, he knew he had made a mistake. The walls were peeling, and the air was thick with dust and decay. The only sound was the echo of his footsteps as he walked down the long, dark hallway. He was there to evaluate the patients, but he couldn't help feeling a sense of foreboding. As he reached the end of the hallway, he was met with a large steel door. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open and stepping into the common area. The room was filled with patients, all staring at him with blank expressions. Jacob took a deep breath and began his evaluations, starting with a patient named John, who was sitting in a corner of the room, rocking back and forth. "Hi, John. My name is Dr. Andrews. Can you tell me a little about yourself?" Jacob asked, pulling out his clipboard and pen. John stared at him for a moment before starting to talk in a low, monotone voice. He spoke about his childhood, his parents, and his struggles with depression. Jacob listened intently, trying to get a sense of who John was. As he continued his evaluations, Jacob couldn't help but feel that something was off. The patient seemed to be hiding something, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't until later that night, when Jacob was alone in his room, that things started to get really strange. He heard footsteps outside his door, and when he opened it, there was no one there. The door to the common area was open, and he could hear the patients whispering to each other. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. When he turned around, he saw a figure standing in the corner of his room. It was John, but his eyes were dark and empty. Jacob tried to back away, but he tripped and fell, hitting his head on the edge of the bed. As he lay there, dazed and confused, he saw the patients start to surround him. They were all chanting something in unison, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Suddenly, everything went dark, and Jacob passed out. When he woke up, he was in a different room. It was dark, and he could hear the sound of dripping water. As he tried to sit up, he realized that he was tied to a chair. He looked around, trying to get his bearings, but there was nothing in the room except for a small table in front of him. On the table, there was a note. "Welcome to our world, Dr. Andrews. We hope you enjoy your stay." Jacob's heart started racing as he realized that he was in serious trouble. He struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. Suddenly, he heard footsteps outside the door, and he knew that whoever was coming for him wasn't going to be friendly. As the door creaked open, Jacob braced himself for the worst. But what he saw on the other side was even more terrifying than he could have imagined. It was John, but he was no longer the meek and mild patient that Jacob had met earlier. He was standing there, holding a bloody knife, with a grin on his face. "You should have never come here, Dr. Andrews," John said, his voice low and menacing. Jacob tried to reason with him, but it was no use. John was beyond reason, and he was determined to kill Jacob. Just as John was about to strike, the door burst open, and a group of police officers rushed in. Jacob breathed a sigh of relief as the police officers took John into custody. He was taken to the hospital to be treated for his injuries, and as he lay there, he couldn't help but wonder what had happened. The police questioned him, but Jacob couldn't remember much. All he knew was that he had been attacked by John, and that the other patients had been involved somehow. It wasn't until later, when he was going through his notes, that he found a clue. One of the patients, a woman named Emily, had mentioned a dark force that was controlling the others. Jacob dug deeper, and what he found shocked him. The asylum had a dark past, and it was rumored that the patients had been subjected to horrific experiments. The dark force that Emily had mentioned was actually a supernatural entity that had taken control of the patients, driving them to madness and murder. Jacob knew that he had to put an end to it, but he wasn't sure how. He consulted with a local priest, who suggested that they perform an exorcism on the asylum. It was a risky plan, but Jacob knew that it was the only way to stop the entity from hurting anyone else. He gathered a team of experts, including a psychic, a demonologist, and a team of priests, and they began the exorcism. It was a long and grueling process, but in the end, they were successful. The entity was banished, and the patients began to return to their senses. As Jacob walked out of the asylum, he knew that his life would never be the same. He had witnessed true horror, and he had come face to face with a supernatural entity that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. But he also knew that he had made a difference. He had saved the patients from a fate worse than death, and he had put an end to the dark force that had haunted the asylum for so many years. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay hidden in the darkness, waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for listening to this bedtime story, and remember, if you struggle with falling or staying asleep at night, click on the first link in the description for the ultimate solution to your problem. Now, choose one of these two videos and continue on our journey in the world of bedtime stories.